It started before sunrise when the streets were still quiet and the wind cut sharp through Southside alleys. FBI trucks rolled slow down Drexel Boulevard, and heavy boots smashed through the doors of an old theater that smelled like dust and gun oil. Inside, walls had Arabic words painted across them, and piles of cash sat beside crates of weapons. Somebody whispered over a radio, "This is it. We got 'em." They found notebooks, coded calls, and a tape with Libya written on it. A Chicago gang talking to Gaddafi's people was the kind of thing nobody believed until they heard the recordings themselves. But before all that madness, you gotta understand how it even started. Southside Chicago in the late 50s was cold in more ways than one. Factories were closing, city leaders stopped caring, and families were left holding nothing but broken promises. In Woodlawn, empty lots and burned-out buildings stretched like scars across the blocks. Every kid knew the streets better than their classrooms, and every corner carried a choice between getting jumped or finding protection. That's where Jeff Fort came in. Born in 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi, and raised on Chicago's South Side, Fort had that sharp kind of energy that drew people in. By the early 60s, he met another young hustler named Eugene Bull Hairston inside the St. Charles Juvenile Detention Center. Two boys with nothing but big mouths and big dreams found common ground. When they got out, they didn't go back to school. They went back to the streets. The streets back then were wild. Gangs popped up on every block, fighting over scraps, fighting because they had nothing else to do. Fort and Hairston decided to flip that. They started organizing kids from their neighborhood around Blackstone Avenue and called themselves the Blackstone Rangers. What began as a crew for protection turned into something bigger. They weren't just fighting other gangs, they were building unity. Fort told his boys they weren't criminals. They were soldiers, protectors, and family. By 1966, the Blackstone Rangers had over 1,000 members. Fort called himself chief, and Hairston became his right-hand man. They set up a leadership circle called the Main 21, made up of street captains who handled everything from recruitment to discipline. They wore red berets, marched in line, and even held meetings like they were running a company. People in Woodlawn started respecting them because they kept order where the police wouldn't go. At first, Fort was known as Angel. He earned that name for breaking up fights and keeping the peace at block parties. But power changes everything. The more the Rangers grew, the more control he wanted. They started collecting what Fort called street taxes, money from drug dealers, shop owners, and anyone using their territory. The same crew that once claimed to protect the neighborhood began acting like the law itself. Still, Fort had vision. He wasn't just about money. He wanted influence. In his mind, the Rangers could become something official, like a political force. He talked about turning them into a community army, one that could bargain with city officials and demand funding. Around this time, the War on Poverty program started pouring federal money into inner-city organizations. Fort saw opportunity in that. His crew cleaned up parks, ran youth programs, and met with church leaders. From the outside, it looked like redemption. From the inside, it was strategy. By the late 60s, the Blackstone Rangers became the most organized street gang in America. They had uniforms, ranks, and codes of conduct. They weren't hiding anymore. The police knew their names, and City Hall knew their faces. People said Fort could walk into any neighborhood on the South Side and have total control within minutes. The line between protector and predator was fading, but nobody wanted to admit it yet. The streets had never seen anything like it. The Rangers were no longer just boys with switchblades. They were a movement, structured, loud, and impossible to ignore. Jeff Fort had taken the chaos around him and built an empire out of it. What started on one street corner was now spreading across the city. When the 60s turned to the 70s, Fort's name was everywhere. He wasn't just a gang leader anymore. He was a man moving through church meetings and city offices. That's when Reverend John Fry, a white pastor from Woodlawn's First Presbyterian Church, stepped into the picture. Fry was desperate to stop the violence in his neighborhood, and he thought the only way to do it was to work with Fort instead of against him. The federal government had just rolled out a $1 million anti-poverty grant aimed at helping inner-city youth. Fry helped Fort and his group apply for it under a new name, the Blackstone Nation. On paper, they were a community organization helping kids find jobs and stay out of trouble. In reality, Fort used that money to strengthen his power. He bought cars, paid lieutenants, and set up offices that looked like legitimate headquarters. For the first time, a street gang had turned into a corporation. The Main 21 became its board, complete with treasurers, security officers, and public spokesmen. They held meetings like business executives, wrote rules, and even printed ID cards for members. Under Fort's leadership, the Blackstone Nation grew to over 5,000 members. They controlled large parts of the South Side and parts of the West Side too. They collected street dues and enforced them like taxes. Fort dressed sharp, wore tailored suits, and drove Cadillacs. He showed up at community events, gave speeches about peace, and even got invited to President Richard Nixon's 1969 inauguration. Reporters called him a symbol of black empowerment. In the neighborhoods, kids followed him like a folk hero. Parents respected him because he could keep the streets quiet when the cops couldn't. But behind the image, the Black P. Stones were moving drugs, running extortion rings, and silencing anyone who got in their way. By 1970, the illusion started cracking. Government officials began asking questions about the missing federal funds. Investigators found that money meant for youth programs had gone into private accounts connected to Fort's crew. When word got out, the press flipped. The same newspapers that once praised Fort now called him a fraud. Congress demanded answers. In 1972, Fort was subpoenaed to testify before a Senate subcommittee on urban crime. He walked in wearing sunglasses and a silk shirt, calm as ever. When asked about the misuse of funds, he dodged questions, smiling, refusing to name names. That performance made him infamous. Shortly after, he was convicted of misusing federal grants and sentenced to prison. Prison didn't break him, it refined him. From inside those walls, Fort started thinking differently. He saw how political power worked, how government systems moved, and how the streets could be controlled from a distance. Even locked away, he sent messages to his people, keeping the organization alive. When he finally came out, his old empire was waiting. But the man who stepped out wasn't the same one who went in. He had watched how the government operated and how corruption wore a suit. He began speaking about power in a new way, mixing religion with control. He believed if he couldn't rule by politics, he'd rule by faith. The streets were still his kingdom, but now his crown came with a cause. When Jeff Fort landed in Leavenworth, he wasn't the same flashy street boss the city used to know. He had been stripped of his cars, his power, and his people, sitting behind heavy steel doors where noise echoed like ghosts. Prison is where a lot of men lose themselves, but for Fort, it was the place where he found something else. He started reading, thinking, and talking to anyone who could feed his curiosity. Somewhere between those walls and long nights, he discovered the teachings of Islam. It started small, just conversations with other inmates who were part of the Nation of Islam or followers of Moorish science. They handed him books about self-discipline, brotherhood, and divine purpose. He began reading about Noble Drew Ali, the man who founded the Moorish Science Temple of America back in the early 1900s. The message hit him hard because it wasn't about begging for respect. It was about claiming it. It said black men were descendants of Moors, not slaves, and that they could rise through self-knowledge and unity. That kind of talk made sense to Fort because he had always believed power came from controlling your own. He started adopting the language and symbols that came with it. He traded street slang for Arabic phrases, wore a kufi, and began praying 5 times a day. It wasn't just religion for him, it was a new system of order, a way to rebuild authority. Inside Leavenworth, people started calling him Prince Malik, and he liked how it sounded. It gave him presence, like a leader of something greater than a gang. When he talked, he spoke about structure, loyalty, and righteousness. He turned cells into classrooms, preaching about peace and discipline while quietly planning a comeback. When Fort got out in 1976, Chicago had changed, but not in the way he imagined. The city was rougher, the drugs harder, and the cops meaner. The Black P. Stone Nation was still alive, but it was scattered, with small sets fighting each other and rival crews trying to take their territory. Fort saw the streets turning into chaos without his control. He knew he couldn't just step back into the same old game. He needed a new identity, something that would pull the gang back together and protect him from the law at the same time. That's when he made his next move. He joined the Moorish Science Temple of America in Milwaukee for a short while, learning how the group operated and how it mixed religion with organization. The Moorish Science movement had religious protection under U.S. law, which meant the government couldn't spy or raid them like regular groups. Fort saw that and realized it could be his cover. He took that idea and built his own version around it. In 1977, he rebranded the Black P. Stone Nation into something new. He called it Rukn, which in Arabic means the pillar. Rukn wasn't just a new name, it was a whole transformation. Members started calling themselves Muslim soldiers, and they began using Arabic titles like Imam and Minister. They wore fezes, turbans, and robes to match their new spiritual image. Fort told them they were no longer gang members, they were part of a movement guided by divine law. On paper, they were a religious organization, but on the streets, they were still running the same hustles, just under a holy cover. That was the genius behind Fort's plan. By turning his gang into a religious group, he made it almost impossible for law enforcement to track them the way they used to. Police couldn't wiretap a mosque or send informants into a religious meeting without major pushback. Fort knew that the First Amendment could be used as a shield, and he used it well. He registered Rukn as a religious institution and even started calling his followers disciples of Islam. Inside, though, it was all about power, money, and obedience. Rukn's new headquarters became the heart of that empire. Fort bought an old movie theater at 39th and Drexel Boulevard, a big brick building that had been shut down for years. He called it the Fort, and that name fit perfectly. The place was rebuilt with bricked-up windows, steel gates, and reinforced walls. People said there were tunnels underneath, escape routes, and secret rooms for meetings. From the outside, it looked like a run-down theater, but inside it was a fortress. It had an office for Fort, a throne-like chair in the center, and murals with Arabic writing and Islamic symbols. Members had to pass strict rules to even get inside. They went through searches, carried coded ID numbers, and used passwords to move around. Inside, it looked like religion, but the vibe felt like military command. Fort had turned Rukn into a cult-style organization. He spoke like a prophet and ruled like a general. Nobody questioned his word. They called him Chief Malik, and when he walked into a room, everyone stood silent. He enforced discipline harder than ever. Drugs were banned for members, and breaking that rule could get you killed. Rukn didn't want addicts. They wanted soldiers who followed orders. Alcohol and gambling were outlawed too, but outside money still flowed in through heroin and cocaine sales. Members weren't allowed to use the stuff, but they could sell it as part of the business. It was the same street game with a holy cover on top. Fort preached that they were building a nation within a nation, something pure that could stand against a corrupt system. Still, that purity came with blood. Anyone who betrayed Rukn or disrespected the code disappeared fast. There were stories of members being executed for stealing money or talking to cops. Some said Fort ordered the killings personally, sending messages to his lieutenants from the fort. His soldiers followed every word because they believed he was chosen. He told them that serving Rukn was serving God, and they didn't argue with that. By the early 80s, the Rukn name carried serious weight across Chicago. They weren't just another gang anymore, they were a movement with military structure and religious identity. Other gangs feared them because their loyalty ran deeper than money. Fort had built something powerful again, but this time it was wrapped in faith. As the group grew, Fort started dealing with outsiders like politicians and business owners who wanted protection or influence in Southside neighborhoods. Some of them saw Rukn as a stabilizing force because they kept order in their zones. Others saw them as a growing threat that mixed religion with organized crime. Either way, Fort didn't care what they thought. He believed he had found the perfect balance of spiritual cover and street control. But with power came paranoia. Fort didn't trust anyone outside his closest circle. He started cutting off people who questioned him, labeling them non-believers. Some of his oldest allies were replaced by younger soldiers who worshipped him completely. Inside the fort, his word was law, and his image hung on the walls next to portraits of Islamic leaders. He saw himself as both a king and a holy man, and his followers treated him like one. Rukn was now a symbol of how far Jeff Fort's mind had traveled. He had turned a street gang into something that looked like a spiritual empire, but the streets were watching and the feds were listening. The same tactics that made him untouchable were also drawing attention from higher up. Chicago's police had never seen anything like it, and Washington was starting to pay attention too. Fort had built his armor out of faith, but it wouldn't be long before the cracks started to show. By the time the name Rukn started echoing through every corner of Chicago, Jeff Fort had already turned his gang into something bigger than a street crew. He had built a religion of loyalty around himself, and everyone under him was expected to move like soldiers. But in the streets, power always comes with envy, and inside the nation, not everybody liked how Fort ran things. The first sign of real trouble came in 1977 when blood spilled close to home. Mickey Cogwell had once been one of Fort's closest lieutenants. He was sharp, well-dressed, and respected by both hustlers and church folks. People called him Mr. Mickey, and he was one of the few who could talk to politicians and street cats in the same breath. Cogwell had helped build the Black Pea Stone Nation from the ground up, and when Fort went to prison, Mickey was the man who kept the organization together. But when Fort came out, he came out a changed man, calling himself Prince Malik and moving like a prophet instead of a partner. Cogwell didn't buy into all that religious talk. He wanted to keep the gang business sharp and profitable, not buried under robes and prayers. The two men started drifting apart, their followers splitting into different sides. In the winter of 1977, that tension finally turned deadly. One cold February night, Mickey Cogwell was walking near his home in Hyde Park when a car pulled up beside him. Shots rang out, and he dropped right there on the sidewalk. Witnesses said it was fast, professional, and cold. The police couldn't prove anything, but everybody on the South Side whispered the same thing. Jeff Fort wanted Mickey gone. That murder sent a message through every block in Chicago. Mickey's crew broke away and started their own organization called the Mickey Cobras. They kept the snake as their symbol, claiming they were the true heirs of the old nation. That split changed the power map of the city. What used to be one united gang turned into rival empires, both trying to control the drug trade in the streets. For Fort, it was a warning that even loyalty could turn deadly if pride got involved. After Mickey's death, Fort tightened his grip harder than ever. Inside Rukn, everything became about control, discipline, and silence. The old brothers who remembered the early days of the Blackstone Rangers were replaced by new recruits who only knew Malik as their leader. He told them Mickey's fate was what happened to men who challenged divine order. The followers believed it, and fear became his strongest weapon. Still, even as bodies dropped and stories spread, Fort wasn't done reaching for power outside the streets. In the early 80s, Chicago was deep in political change. Harold Washington was running for mayor in 1983, hoping to become the city's first black mayor. His campaign brought energy to the South Side, where people were tired of being ignored. Rukn saw opportunity in that movement, and so did Fort. He realized politics could be another hustle, one that paid better and came with respect. Federal investigators later found out that during the 1983 mayoral race, Rukn got involved in voter mobilization. They worked the streets, registering voters, moving ballots, and showing up at rallies. The operation wasn't free. The campaign paid around $70,000 for their services, money that supposedly went to community outreach. On paper, it looked like Rukn was helping democracy, but everyone knew the real motive. Fort wanted political connections that could protect him from law enforcement and give his organization legitimacy. The move worked for a while. Politicians didn't want to admit they were working with a known gang, but nobody could deny that Rukn had influence. They could bring hundreds of people to rallies and control blocks that were hard for regular campaigners to reach. For Fort, politics was just another street game, except this one came with better suits and fewer bullets. Around that same time, Fort tried to push Rukn into the world of business. He set up something called the El Pyramid Corporation, a front that was supposed to handle community programs, real estate, and cultural projects. It had offices, letterheads, and even business cards, all giving the impression that Rukn had turned corporate. But the streets knew the truth. The El Pyramid Corporation was a cover for money laundering and extortion. It helped clean the cash coming from drug operations and made the gang look legitimate to outsiders. Fort also launched something called the Rukn Law School, which was supposed to train young black men in legal studies. It had no accreditation, no professors, and no classes. It existed mostly on paper, but it gave Fort a new layer of respect in the community. People said he was trying to build a black mafia state, a structure where street power, religion, and business all blended into one system. The fort on Drexel was its capital, and Fort was its ruler. But the more he tried to build legitimacy, the more heat he drew from the law. Detectives like Jack Brannigan and Dan Kolovitz from the Chicago Police Department started watching him close. They were old-school cops who didn't care about his religious freedom claims. They believed he was running one of the biggest criminal networks in the Midwest, and they made it their mission to bring him down. Every time they tried to get close, though, Fort stayed one step ahead. His people were disciplined, loyal, and trained not to talk. There were stories floating around the South Side about how Fort could see through people, how he knew when someone was lying before they even opened their mouth. Some said he had a list of every detective who followed him, and he would call out their names during meetings just to show he was untouchable. Others claimed he had people inside city offices, feeding him information before warrants could drop. Whether those stories were real or not didn't even matter, because the myth of Jeff Fort had become stronger than the truth. By the mid-'80s, kids who never met him spoke his name like a legend. They called him the Chief, and his image hung in houses like a saint. For some, he was the man who gave structure to chaos, who made the South Side feel protected from outsiders. For others, he was the man who turned faith into fear and used religion as a mask for violence. Either way, nobody ignored him. Fort stayed mostly out of sight, speaking through messages delivered by trusted lieutenants. Inside the fort, meetings were filled with both spiritual chants and business talk. One moment they were reciting prayers, and the next they were dividing territories and profits. It was the perfect mix of divine theater and criminal strategy. The police kept trying to catch him slipping, raiding his properties and arresting low-level soldiers, but Fort never broke. Every raid just made him look stronger. Reporters started calling him a ghost, a man who ran an empire without touching the streets. Even his enemies admitted that his control was unmatched. He had turned paranoia into protection and silence into loyalty. Still, underneath all that control, cracks were starting to show. Old members whispered that Fort was becoming too paranoid, too isolated, and too obsessed with purity. The young ones followed him blindly, but the older heads remembered when things were simpler, before religion, before politics, before blood became the price of loyalty. The fort on Drexel was a fortress, but it was also a cage, trapping a man who once ruled the streets with nothing but charisma and a plan. By the end of 1983, Jeff Fort had everything he thought he wanted: power, respect, and protection. But the game was changing again. The law was getting smarter, and the world outside Chicago was about to pull him into something far darker than anything he had faced before. By the time the mid-80s hit, the streets of Chicago were changing, but Jeff Fort was changing faster. The man who once called himself Angel was now Chief Malik, ruling from behind locked doors like a prophet with a private army. Outside, America was shifting under President Ronald Reagan, who was flexing hard against anything that smelled like foreign threat. Across the ocean, Libya's leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was making sure his name stayed in every American headline. Gaddafi had been calling himself the defender of the oppressed, the voice of anti-imperialism, and the enemy of the United States government. He blamed Washington for destroying African nations, stealing oil, and enslaving black people through capitalism. His message sounded crazy to some, but for a lot of struggling black communities in America, parts of it hit home. Gaddafi talked about black liberation, about giving weapons and money to help revolutionary brothers rise up against their enemies. That kind of talk started turning heads in the ghettos, where folks already felt abandoned by the system. Back home, the Reagan administration was turning the heat up on drugs and gangs. The war on crime was in full swing, and Chicago's South Side was under constant watch. But while the feds were busy chasing street dealers, Jeff Fort was dreaming bigger. He wasn't thinking about corners anymore. He was thinking about countries. The man who once ran the South Side wanted to play on a world stage, and in his mind, Gaddafi was the perfect partner. In 1985, Gaddafi made a move that sent shockwaves through America's political circles. He appeared by satellite during a rally organized by Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam in Chicago. Thousands of people gathered to hear the Libyan leader speak live from Tripoli. Gaddafi called the United States government evil and offered $10 million to help the struggle of black Americans. That broadcast didn't just reach the Nation of Islam, it reached Fort too. Inside his headquarters on Drexel Boulevard, Rukn members tuned in, watching the man in the military uniform speak with fire in his voice. From that moment, Fort saw something in Gaddafi that clicked with him. Both men saw themselves as misunderstood revolutionaries, hated by the government but loved by their people. Inside the fort, portraits of Gaddafi started hanging next to Fort's own pictures. The two faces looked out from the same walls, one in military green, the other in a red kufi, both staring like they shared the same mission. Fort told his soldiers that Libya was proof a man could stand against the American machine and win. In prison, Fort started talking about Gaddafi like a mentor he hadn't met yet. During visits and phone calls, his words shifted from street business to global politics. He talked about imperialism, about fighting the system, about building a nation within a nation. His conversations with trusted members carried a new kind of energy, like he was mixing religion with rebellion. It wasn't just about money anymore. He wanted recognition, respect, and revenge against the country that locked him up and tore down his empire. That obsession grew deeper after he was transferred to the federal prison in Bastrop, Texas. From that cell, he still ran Rukn like a general on the outside. He used coded phone calls, hidden messages and letters, and loyal visitors to keep communication alive. While most inmates worried about commissary snacks, Fort was running international plays from behind the wall. Around that same time, Gaddafi was looking for American contacts who could help him strike back against the U.S. government. Reagan had bombed Libyan outposts, and Gaddafi wanted payback. Libyan intelligence officers started reaching out quietly to radical groups in the States, trying to find people willing to help with small acts of sabotage or terror. They wanted symbolic hits, something that would make America feel pain without starting a full war. That's when the lines between a street gang and an international conspiracy started to blur. In 1986, through a few middlemen, Libyan agents reached out to people close to Rukn. One of the key go-betweens was a man who had ties both to Chicago's underworld and Middle Eastern contacts. He approached Fort's top lieutenants with whispers about an opportunity that could bring serious money and power. The message was simple. Libya had cash, weapons, and a cause. All they needed were people on American soil willing to carry out orders. Word of that offer reached Fort's ears fast. Even locked up in Bastrop, he had eyes and ears everywhere. His people arranged meetings through intermediaries in places like Panama and even Tripoli. These weren't random street hustlers. These were Rukn representatives traveling under fake names, sitting at tables with Libyan officials. The deal they discussed was wild. Libya was ready to pay $2.5 million for Rukn's help in launching attacks inside the United States. In return, the gang would receive weapons, money, and even shipments of drugs to help fund their organization. According to later testimony, Libya wanted the Rukns to hit specific targets, including government buildings and airplanes. They didn't need precision, they needed chaos. For Fort, it wasn't just about cash. He saw it as divine justice, a way to strike back at a country that had betrayed his people. He told his men they were soldiers in a holy war, fighting for liberation, not terrorism. That line blurred fast, but his followers didn't question it. The communication between Fort and his lieutenants became a masterclass in coded language. Phone calls that sounded harmless carried hidden meaning. He would talk about apples, potatoes, and the young friend. Each word meant something deeper. Apples could mean weapons, potatoes could mean cash, and the young friend referred to the Libyan contact. His code was clever enough to pass most early surveillance, but not forever. The FBI had been watching Rukn for years, but now the situation was different. What started as a gang investigation had turned into a national security problem. Federal agents began recording phone calls, tracing flights, and tracking financial transfers that led to Libyan sources. They started piecing together that a Chicago street gang was in direct communication with the government accused of sponsoring terrorism. Inside the Bastrop prison, Fort had built a communication web using corrupt staff, coded notes, and loyal visitors who carried his words outside. Some of those visitors had no idea they were part of something that big. They thought they were just running errands for the boss, but the FBI was listening, decoding, and slowly realizing what Fort was building. One of the clearest clues came during a recorded conversation between Fort and one of his top men, Henry Harris. They were talking about potatoes and a friend overseas. The feds played that tape again and again, breaking down every pause and word. The more they listened, the clearer it became that Fort was talking about a foreign power offering money for attacks on American soil. Fort's ability to control his empire from prison stunned investigators. He had turned a federal cell into a command center. His people still followed his orders, still moved drugs, and now some of them were sitting in rooms with Libyan agents. For years, nobody believed a street gang could reach that high. But Fort had already proven that religion could make him untouchable. Now he was trying to prove that connections could make him unstoppable. The FBI's counterterrorism unit stepped in, and Chicago became the center of one of the strangest federal cases in U.S. history. They started planting informants inside Rukn, wiring phones, and following every person connected to Fort. The more they uncovered, the crazier it got. They found that Fort's people were talking about buying weapons like rocket launchers and explosives. They were discussing ways to bomb targets in return for payment from Libya. At the same time, Fort's lieutenants were growing paranoid. They knew something big was happening, but they couldn't tell how deep the government was involved. Some thought the feds were bluffing. Others believed the Libyans were bluffing too. Fort didn't care. He believed he was protected by divine purpose. Inside that prison, he saw himself as more than a gang leader. He was a revolutionary, a spiritual warrior fighting an empire. By late 1986, the FBI had enough to make a move. They had tapes, witnesses, and records linking Rukn to Libyan agents. What started as street surveillance had turned into an international counterterrorism case. The man who built a gang from a single Chicago street was now being watched like a foreign threat. The same walls that once kept him safe were now echoing with his own downfall. Still, even as the investigation closed in, Fort stayed calm. He believed no one could touch him because his mission was righteous. He had turned faith into armor and fear into loyalty, but the feds were patient. methodical, and ready to tear that armor apart. When the agents finally closed the circle, they realized they weren't just dealing with a Chicago story anymore. This was global. This was a tale of a street boss who turned into a political pawn, mixing religion, revenge, and ambition into something that scared both the streets and the state. And as the FBI built their case, one truth became clear. Jeff Fort's war had crossed borders, and the storm that followed was about to hit harder than anything Chicago had ever seen. The first time the FBI heard the word Libya in connection with Rukn, nobody believed it meant anything serious. To most agents, it sounded like street talk, just another slang term thrown around in coded calls. But one man in the Chicago field office, Special Agent Bill Dyson, couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. The tape he played in 1985 had Jeff Fort's voice, calm and confident, talking about our friends overseas. At first, Dyson thought it was just a drug pipeline. Then Fort said something about getting the money from the Libyans, and the room went quiet. Dyson had worked gang cases before, but he had never heard a Chicago street boss talk like a foreign operative. The more he listened, the more the language felt like strategy, not slang. He spent nights replaying the tapes, hearing Fort's voice over static, giving orders from Bastrop Prison using strange codes. Dyson's team started cross-checking words, matching potatoes and apples against reports of shipments, money drops, and meetings in Panama. Every time they put the puzzle together, Libya showed up again. That was when the FBI decided to move in deeper. They brought in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, a mix of federal agents, local police, and intelligence analysts. Nobody in the room could believe they were investigating a street gang for terrorism. It sounded like a movie plot, but the tapes kept piling up. The agents traced calls from Fort's prison line to known Rukn hangouts in Chicago, and from there to numbers linked to Libyan contacts overseas. The connections were real, and the danger was too big to ignore. Dyson got clearance to run a full undercover operation. The plan was simple, but risky. They would send an undercover agent into Rukn's circle, pretending to be an arms broker who could get military-grade weapons. If Fort's people were serious about buying rockets, this would prove it. The agent went in under a fake name, meeting with top Rukn members like Henry Harris and Derek Bam Coleman. Those meetings were recorded on hidden cameras, every handshake and whisper caught on tape. The undercover agent played his role perfectly, talking about rocket launchers, explosives, and high-grade firearms. He showed photos, price lists, and fake credentials that made him look legit. The Rukn lieutenants took the bait immediately. They bragged about their international connections, saying they had a friend in Libya who was ready to pay. They told him their boss, Chief Malik, was locked up but still in charge, and that everything ran through his orders. Meanwhile, Fort was still making phone calls from Bastrop, speaking in that same calm, coded tone. He never used direct words like bomb or Libya. Instead, he talked about the young friend needing apples for the shipment. Each word sounded harmless until agents translated the pattern. Every apple meant a weapon, every potato meant cash, and the young friend meant the Libyan contact. Fort gave his orders like a man reading scripture, smooth and certain, his voice steady even when the world around him was closing in. By early 1986, the FBI had enough to move the operation into its final stage. They called it Operation Iron Eagle, a name that fit the scale of what they were about to uncover. They planted more listening devices inside Rukn's headquarters on Drexel Boulevard, the same old theater Fort had turned into a fortress. They tracked drug routes, bank deposits, and communications between Chicago and foreign agents. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. Rukn wasn't just pretending to be a political group. They were actively trying to make deals with Libya for money, drugs, and weapons in exchange for violence on U.S. soil. The most chilling piece of evidence came when one of the undercover meetings was videotaped inside a safe house. On the tape, several Rukn members stood in front of a picture of Gaddafi, raising their right hands and pledging allegiance to him. The oath was short, almost ritualistic. They promised loyalty to our brother leader and vowed to carry out missions for the cause. When Dyson saw that video, he knew the investigation had crossed from criminal into historic. A Chicago street gang had officially pledged themselves to a foreign dictator. The agents wanted proof that the group was willing to act, not just talk. So the undercover operative offered to sell them a weapon, a genuine anti-tank rocket that had been rendered safe by the FBI. The Rukn men took it without hesitation. They even posed with it, smiling, talking about how they could make the city feel it. What they didn't know was that every second of that transaction was being filmed by federal cameras hidden in the walls. After months of watching, recording, and gathering evidence, the FBI was ready to strike. The raids were planned for September 10th, 1986, a date marked on the calendar of every agency involved. They coordinated between Chicago police, federal marshals, and counterterrorism agents. The targets were clear: the fort on Drexel, the El Pyramid Corporation's office, several stash houses, and homes of key lieutenants. Before sunrise, armored trucks rolled through Southside streets just like they had years earlier during gang raids. But this time, it wasn't just narcotics or guns they were after. This was national security. Agents in bulletproof vests kicked down the doors of the fort, shouting commands, smashing through the same bricked windows that once made the building untouchable. The place that had been Jeff Fort's temple now looked like a war zone. Inside, they found weapons, piles of cash, ledgers with coded notes, and photos linking members to Libyan officials. They also found military manuals, Arabic documents, and letters written in Fort's handwriting talking about training and operations. Everything matched what the tapes had suggested. Down in the basement, agents found crates marked with false labels that were supposed to hold construction materials. Inside were drugs, automatic weapons, and military-style uniforms. Other teams hit houses across the city at the same time. One house on the west side had fake passports, another had photos from meetings in Panama, and one had audio tapes with messages meant for our friend overseas. It was the biggest coordinated gang raid in Chicago's history. By the end of the day, dozens of El Rukn members were in custody. The fort on Drexel was sealed off with yellow tape, surrounded by police cars and news cameras. Reporters swarmed the scene, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The headlines came fast that evening: Chicago gang, linked to international terrorists. The story went national and then global. News anchors who had never heard of the Black Pea Stone Nation were now saying the name El Rukn on live television. For the FBI, it was both a victory and a nightmare. They had stopped what could have been a real terrorist attack, but the implications were massive. A street gang from the South Side had connected with the foreign government, and that revelation forced everyone to rethink what organized crime could look like. As the agents processed evidence, Dyson couldn't stop thinking about Jeff Fort sitting in his cell in Texas. Even with all the power stripped away, Fort had still managed to reach across oceans and cause panic inside Washington. The walls around him couldn't contain his influence, but now those same walls were closing in. The fort was empty now, its walls covered in spray paint from years of fear and faith mixed together. The symbols, the Arabic writing, the portraits of Gaddafi, and the coded ledgers, all of it was evidence now, boxed up and tagged for trial. What once stood as a monument to Fort's rule had become proof of his downfall. Outside, kids who used to shout El Rukn in pride were watching news trucks film their neighborhood. The myth was breaking. The man they thought was untouchable had brought the eyes of the whole world onto their streets. The storm that started with one Chicago boy in a juvenile cell had now reached a global scale, and Operation Iron Eagle had finally brought it crashing down. When the indictments dropped in early 1987, it hit the city like a bomb. The name Jeff Fort was already legend on Chicago's South Side, but now it was lighting up national headlines. The same man who once called himself Chief Malik was being accused of something that sounded straight out of a spy movie. Federal prosecutors charged him with conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism for a foreign government, Libya. They said he had turned a neighborhood gang into an extension of Gaddafi's regime. The papers called it America's first domestic terror case. The charges ran deep. The grand jury hit Fort and his top men with over 50 counts, covering conspiracy, weapons violations, narcotics trafficking, and communications with a foreign power. The indictment read like a war dossier instead of a criminal case. The government accused El Rukn of planning to bomb buildings, attack planes, and assist Libya's secret agents in return for millions of dollars. Jeff Fort, sitting in a federal cell in Bastrop, Texas, was now being called a traitor to his country. The news spread fast. Every network wanted a piece of the story. Cameras rolled outside the courthouse, reporters shouted over each other, and newspapers ran photos of Fort in a red kufi beside pictures of Gaddafi. The headlines were wild, from gang leader to terrorist ally, Chicago street boss linked to Libyan plot, the American Gaddafi. The Southside community was divided. Some people said the government was exaggerating, trying to destroy a powerful black leader. Others said Fort had finally crossed a line that nobody could defend. When the trial opened in the fall of 1987, the courtroom looked like a theater. Rows of reporters filled every seat. Sketch artists drew Fort's face as he sat still, hands folded, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He didn't speak much, but his presence carried through the room. The prosecutors walked in with stacks of files, audio tapes, and videotapes, ready to show the world what they had found. The centerpiece of the government's case was something they called the 747 Project. That was the code name investigators gave to Fort's alleged plan to attack American targets on behalf of Libya. The jurors listened as agents described how Fort's lieutenants had met with Libyan operatives, discussed money transfers, and even held a videotaped oath ceremony to Gaddafi. The tapes played in court, with Rukn members pledging loyalty to the Libyan leader, their voices echoing through the room. It didn't sound like street talk anymore. It sounded like allegiance. Then came the wiretap recordings. The FBI had spent months collecting them, capturing Fort's coded conversations from prison. Jurors heard his calm voice referring to potatoes and apples, while prosecutors explained what each word meant: weapons, money, drugs. They showed how Fort used religious and business fronts to hide criminal operations, how he controlled every move from his cell, and how his lieutenants acted like messengers for his commands. One of the most dramatic moments came when agents described the fort itself. They told the court how the old theater on Drexel Boulevard had been converted into a fortress temple. Inside were murals of Arabic calligraphy, walls lined with pictures of Gaddafi and Fort, and a throne-like chair at the center where Fort once sat during meetings. The jurors saw photos of the setup, and the images hit hard. It didn't look like a gang headquarters, it looked like a cult. Fort's defense team tried to fight back by arguing entrapment. They said the FBI had set him up, sending agents pretending to be arms dealers to trick his followers. They claimed the undercover agent had pushed the idea of buying weapons, not Fort. The lawyers said the government wanted to make an example out of a black leader who had already served his time. They reminded the jury that Fort was in prison the whole time, that he never personally touched a weapon or met a Libyan official. But the prosecutors had more than words. They had tapes, witnesses, and video. Several former Rukn members turned informants and testified about the meetings, the coded calls, and the way Fort ran the organization like a military unit. One of them described how Fort would sit in his chair of judgment, delivering commands that no one dared question. Another said that Fort told them Libya was their ally against the white man's government. Assistant U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas, who led the prosecution, stood before the court and told the jury that this was not a case about race or religion. It was about betrayal. He said, this defendant conspired with a foreign power to harm the country that gave him freedom. He took the blood of his community and sold it for foreign money. His words landed heavy, and the jury sat frozen as he played one final recording of Fort's voice giving approval for the friend's plan. The defense tried to humanize Fort, painting him as a misunderstood man who was trying to help his people. They showed photos of him at charity drives, giving out food and toys to neighborhood kids. They said he used religion to bring discipline to lost youth, not to plan violence, but the evidence kept stacking up. Every time the defense tried to soften the story, another recording or witness undercut it. After weeks of testimony, the jury finally withdrew to deliberate. It didn't take long. When they returned, the courtroom was packed wall to wall with reporters, Rukn members, and federal agents. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. Jeff Fort was guilty on all counts. The same applied to his top lieutenants, including Henry Harris and Earl Queen. The room buzzed with noise, gasps, murmurs, even a few shouts. The judge pounded his gavel until silence came back. Judge Charles Kokoris spoke slowly when he addressed Fort directly. "You are an intelligent man, Mr. Fort," he said. "You had a chance to lead your people towards something better. Instead, you chose to serve a foreign enemy. That is not leadership. That is betrayal." Prosecutor Valukas later told reporters, "This case shows that terrorism is not something that only happens overseas. It can be born right here, in our own neighborhoods." The sentence came down hard. Jeff Fort received 80 years in federal prison for the terrorism and conspiracy charges. The court also ordered hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, seizing assets tied to Rukn's operations. The government wanted to make sure the organization couldn't rise again. But the story didn't stop there. In the following years, Fort faced another series of charges for ordering murders from behind bars. In 1989, he was convicted again, this time for orchestrating multiple killings connected to internal power struggles within Rukn. The judge gave him 75 more years. Altogether, his total sentence reached 168 years, effectively a lifetime behind bars, When the verdicts hit the news, the country reacted with a mix of shock and relief. To some, it was proof that the system had finally taken down one of America's most dangerous men. To others, it was another sign that the government was willing to label black radicalism as terrorism to make a point. But for Chicago, it felt like the end of an era. The city that once feared Jeff Fort now spoke of him in the past tense. In prison, Fort was moved to a maximum security facility, locked away from other inmates, sealed inside a unit reserved for those considered national security threats. He spent his days writing letters and quoting scripture, calling himself a prisoner of conscience. His words reached no farther than the walls around him. The courtroom spectacle had turned into a piece of history. The first time an American citizen was convicted of terrorism on behalf of a foreign nation. The man who started with a small street gang on Blackstone Avenue had gone from local legend to symbol of global menace. In the end, his voice, once powerful enough to unite thousands, was reduced to an echo behind steel and concrete, remembered more for the chaos he created than for the peace he once promised. After the 1987 verdict, the empire Jeff Fort built started breaking apart piece by piece. The fortress on Drexel Boulevard that once stood as the pride of Rukn turned into a federal evidence vault. The murals faded, the Arabic calligraphy peeled, and the chairs that once faced Fort's throne sat covered in dust. What had started as a movement with structure and purpose had become a shattered memory of fear and control. But the government wasn't finished yet. By 1991, prosecutors came back for another strike. They called it the follow-up Rukn trial, and this time it wasn't just about Fort. It was about the entire leadership that kept his operation alive. 21 of his top members were indicted under a new racketeering case, accused of continuing the drug and weapons trades while their leader sat locked up. The government called it a super gang fighting for its life. These men had once been lieutenants, ministers, and enforcers. Now they were defendants sitting shoulder to shoulder, staring down federal prosecutors who had already buried their boss. The trial was chaos from the start. Witnesses switched sides, informants lied, and the press was all over the story again. Reporters wrote that it felt like the last act of a crime family's downfall, the kind of story that mixed religion, politics, and street loyalty in ways nobody could script. The prosecution played tapes from earlier raids, reed-coded letters, and brought in agents who had worked the Libya case. They wanted to prove that Rukn still operated as a criminal organization, even after its leader's conviction. But inside the courtroom, the structure that once kept the gang tight had already collapsed. Some defendants tried to save themselves, cutting deals or pointing fingers. Others stayed loyal to the end, refusing to testify or even speak. The sense of unity that once defined the Black Keystone Nation was gone. Without Fort's voice directing them, there was confusion, mistrust, and silence. For the younger members, Rukn's name still carried fear, but for the old heads, it was just a ghost of what once was. Then came the scandal that shook the case. During the follow-up trials, defense lawyers uncovered that several government witnesses had received secret benefits. Some informants were paid cash, given drugs, or even allowed conjugal visits in exchange for testimony. Prosecutors had withheld details about these deals from the defense. When this came out, the headlines exploded again. The same justice system that had worked so hard to bring Fort down was now under fire for cutting corners. Federal Judge James B. Moran ordered a review, calling the situation a stain on the integrity of the prosecution. Some convictions were overturned and others were reduced. The government had won the war, but their victory was tainted. Critics said they had been so desperate to destroy Rukn that they broke their own rules in the process. For the families of those convicted, it felt like justice had turned into another political game. By the mid-90s, Rukn was a shell of its former self. The leadership structure that once stretched across hundreds of blocks in Chicago was gone. The fort on Drexel was sold, boarded up, and later demolished. The soldiers who once followed orders from Chief Malik were scattered into smaller neighborhood crews. Some joined other sets, others faded into the system, and a few tried to rebuild pieces of the old organization under new names. Jeff Fort himself disappeared from public view. After multiple convictions, he was transferred to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. ADX Florence, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. That's where the government sends the most dangerous and influential inmates, the ones who can still pull strings from behind bars. Fort's name was on that list. In Florence, the rules were cold and simple. 23 hours a day in a cell no bigger than a bathroom. 1 hour of exercise alone inside a cage. No phone calls without approval. No visitors except immediate family. No contact with the outside world. For a man who once commanded thousands with just his voice, the silence was punishment enough. There were no more coded calls, no lieutenants, no councils, no Main 21, just steel, concrete, and time. Prison records described him as calm, disciplined, and quiet. Some guards said he still prayed 5 times a day, keeping the same ritual he started decades ago in Leavenworth. To most of the world, Jeff Fort was finished, forgotten behind bars. But in Chicago, his story refused to die. The streets kept his name alive, passing it through generations like folklore. Some called him a genius who played the system better than anyone else. Others said he was a tyrant who brought ruin to his people. His legacy became a paradox. A man who wanted unity but ruled through fear, who preached peace but built an empire on violence. The offshoots of his organization lived on in different forms. The Mickey Cobras, once part of the same brotherhood, became a separate force in the city's gang landscape. The remaining Black P. Stone sets continued operating in smaller cliques, some still using the old names and symbols. On certain blocks, murals of Jeff Fort's face stayed painted on brick walls, faded by time but untouched by paint rollers. By the 2000s, young gang members who weren't even born during Fort's rise still used his story as a lesson. To some, it was about pride and power. To others, it was about how ambition without limits always ends in downfall. Teachers in community programs would mention his name when talking about wasted potential, while old-timers sitting on stoops would still whisper, "Chief Malik had the city in his hands once." Even now, decades later, the legend feels split down the middle. There's the myth, the story of a man who turned the ghetto into a nation, who challenged the government and paid the price. And then there's the memory, the reality of a leader who let pride and control twist a dream into destruction. Inside ADX Florence, Jeff Fort remains in solitary confinement, serving what adds up to a lifetime sentence. He's nearly 80 now, and the power that once made cities tremble has been reduced to silence. But the mark he left on Chicago still lingers. His name lives between fear and fascination, between criminal history and cultural memory. The Rukn Empire crumbled, but its story became something else entirely. A warning, a legend, and a reminder of how one man's hunger for power turned a neighborhood dream into a global headline. By the time the century turned, Jeff Fort's story had shifted from headline to history, whispered more than spoken. The empire he built had vanished, but its echo still haunted Chicago's South Side. On those same streets, kids who never saw the fort still knew the name. They heard stories of how one man rose from nothing, built an army, and faced the United States government, not as a hero, but as a symbol of what unchecked power could do. Historians later called him a product of his environment, a man who saw no other path to influence in a system that shut him out. Sociologists said the Rukn saga revealed how poverty, politics, and faith could twist into something dangerous when left to feed on anger and pride. In Florence, Jeff Fort grew old in silence, his words reaching no further than concrete walls. Yet his influence remained, shaping how America viewed gangs, religion, and domestic extremism. The line between activist and criminal blurred with his legacy, leaving the question of whether he was a visionary gone wrong or a warning written in blood. What began as a teenage dream on Blackstone Avenue ended as a global cautionary tale. The rise, the power, the faith, and the fall all became a story too strange to invent, too real to forget. Chicago still remembers. The streets still whisper his name, Jeff Fort, Prince Malik, the man who built a nation and lost himself in it.